Good evening, Practical Law. So last week we worked through Chapter 1, which was what is law, and we defined law and what its goals were, what its purpose was. We looked at the fact that there are two types of law. There's criminal law and there's civil law. Criminal law is when you break a law and the government takes you to trial. Those are usually more serious crimes, and to be found guilty, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt because we're dealing with serious crimes and serious punishment. Then you had civil law. Civil law is when individuals can take you to court. These tend to be less serious crimes. Therefore, to get convicted, you need to be proven guilty with a preponderance of the evidence. Okay. So what we're going to be looking at this week in 3 lessons is lawmaking itself. So we talked about the laws last week. Today we're going to look at the lawmaking process. Now, both chapters 1 and 2 are overview chapters. Okay. We're going to go into much more detail as we go throughout the semester on some of the things that we talked about last week and some of the things that we talk about this week. This is also the last chapter that we will do before our first test, which is coming up next week. So be sure you are taking notes. Again, I will tell you some things I definitely want you to copy down, but I kind of expect you guys to take your own notes as we go through this as you would in a college class. If you have any questions or concerns about anything that we talk about, please let me know. I'll be glad to answer them. Okay. So let's talk about lawmaking this week. All right. Now, number one, laws come from a bunch of different sources. Okay. And I do want you to get some of these down. All right. Be sure you get these down. They come from, of course, you have federal law, you have state law, and you have local law. Okay. And those laws are constructed by the governments, federal government, state government, and local government. Okay. We talked about last week the Constitution. The Constitution is the law of the land. Okay. It prescribes laws and it also tells how the government is going to act within the law and to protect your rights. Okay. So a law itself is how the government is going to act to enforce the laws. Okay. Within our government and within the state government and within local governments, the body that makes the law is known as the legislature. And we're going to be talking a lot about the legislature today. That's going to be our primary focus, but this is the body that makes the laws. Then the voters. The voters are direct lawmakers. A lot of times, these laws happen at the local level, but on election day, you will often find ideas to be voted on, bills to be voted on. Of course, if enough people support them, the bill becomes a law. You might actually vote on the law itself. Okay, so voters play a role in creating law. You have administrative agencies, okay, which have the voice of the law. And I'm thinking in the federal government, some of the policies like here recently, the CDC, okay, the FDA, okay, Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, these administrative agencies, when they pass legislation or when they pass suggestions, it has the power of law. Okay. Even the presidential cabinet, if the president and the presidential cabinet come up with certain ideas and stuff like that, they can have the power of law. Okay. So administrative agencies through doctrine can create law. And then, of course, the courts, okay, through the appeals process. And we see this a lot with the Supreme Court. We talked about it with prohibition. We talked about it with Brown versus the Board of Education and Plessy versus Ferguson. Those rulings by the court, which happened because of the appeals process, they had the weight of law as well. Okay, so a bunch of different sources where law can come from today. Our focus for the next couple of minutes is going to be on the legislature. Okay. Now, legislatures exist at all 3 levels. Okay. You have federal legislature, you have a state legislature, and you do have local. We might not call them legislatures, but they would be local lawmaking bodies. And we'll talk briefly about them here in just a second. Okay. These are our primary lawmaking bodies. In fact, that is the power granted to it by the Constitution. Okay, the legislature makes the laws. The executive branch, the president, enforces the laws. okay, and the Supreme Court interprets the laws. Okay, so these are the primary lawmaking bodies. Now, we're going to start with Congress first because it's the national level. Congress is our federal legislature. There are two houses in Congress. I think we talked about this a little bit last week. There is a Senate that has 100 members, two from each state. And then there's a House of Representatives, which is currently at 435 members, and that is determined by population. So the bigger your state, the more representatives you get. Okay. Now, the makeup of our Congress comes from arguments between the big states and the small states over the ratification of the Constitution. The smaller states wanted equal representation, okay, actually in both houses. The bigger states, of course, wanted representation based on population in both the houses. So we compromised. In fact, this is called the Great Compromise. The Senate, everybody's equal. That makes the small states happy. And the House of Representatives, based on population, that makes the big states happy. And of course, both houses have to work together to get laws passed. Now, when Congress passes laws, they are binding to every state. Okay, these are issues of national impact. All right, and I know it sounds silly for us to talk about that, but that is a distinction between, say, a national legislature and a state legislature. When we talk about the state legislatures here in a second, state legislatures, surprise, surprise, only pass laws to the people within their borders. Congress, their laws are binding to every state, and they are of a national impact. Okay. They include, but are not limited to, environmental equality, national defense, homeland security, labor relations, veteran affairs, public health, civil rights, economic development, postal services, federal taxes, and then Social Security and benefit programs. All of these fall under issues of national impact that Congress has legislature over. Okay. And here, of course, is a picture of our Congress building in Washington, D.C. Okay. So Congress is our national legislature. It passes laws that are binding in every state because they are issues of national impact. Right. Now, the next level down, of course, is the state legislature. And as I was saying, they pass laws that apply only within their boundaries. Okay. Most states, except for Nebraska, have a two-house legislature, much like Congress. Okay. Um, they tend to meet on an annual basis or every 2 years. Again, it depends on what state and depends on the state constitution. Okay, but they tend to meet on an annual basis. And to be honest with you, you probably need to meet on an annual basis because you're getting law. I mean, your job is to make laws and make sure the laws are being passed and stuff like that. So you probably want to meet on an annual basis. Congress deals with issues of national impact. The state legislature deals with issues of statewide impact. Okay, so education is going to be important, transportation and traffic laws, state taxes, marriage and divorce. Okay, most criminal laws, although the national government will also deal with criminal law as well, and of course the powers and duties of state governments. Okay. Now, one of the interesting things about state law is there is a degree of reciprocation between the states. For example, all right, if you have a driver's license issued by the state of Virginia, it is good in every state you travel to. Okay. So even though that is a state issue and it's issued by the state, it is also respected by other states. Okay. It's not like I had to have a different driver's license when I drive into North Carolina or when I drive into Pennsylvania or something like that. It will be recognized by the other states. So your state issues it, but it has validity in other states as well. Okay. Um, Now back to our legislature. Okay. The Virginia General Assembly, and it's pretty appropriate that we mention this. Okay. The Virginia General Assembly, which is our state legislature, it has its roots in the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses began at Jamestown in 1619, which makes our legislature the oldest continual state elected representative government in the United States. Okay. So it's kind of a big deal. And it serves as the basis for other state legislatures, as well as a possible model for our national government. Okay. The idea that people would elect representatives for themselves, from themselves, the idea that you would have two houses. We're going to see that down the road when we get to Congress. Okay. So our state legislature is pretty important. Now, there are some other legislatures out there, and I just want to make kind of reference to them real quickly so that you know what they are. Another type of legislature. Oh, and by the way, there is our Capitol building in Richmond. Okay, there's the Richmond State Capitol building right there, designed by Thomas Jefferson. Now, back to the other legislatures. Another form of legislature is a tribal council. Now, this deals specifically with issues for Native American tribes. Okay, and it was one of the powers that the government gave to the tribes as we began placing them on reservations and we began moving them out west and giving them tribal lands. Okay, the tribal council has both legislative authority and both executive authority, and it was at one point in time it was given power to deal with issues within tribal boundaries. Now, recently, there has been a push to kind of decrease the power of tribal councils. For example, at one point in time, if a murder occurred within the tribal lands, the tribal council dealt with it. It's probably good simply because of funding and resources and things that a government like a state government or a national government get involved if a murder occurs. So when I say we've seen a decrease in recent years, and by recent years, I would say the latter half of the 20th century, okay, maybe even before that. So when I say there's been a decrease in power in that, it's that sort of thing. Okay. They still have some power over certain issues within the tribe. Okay. Usually amongst tribal members themselves, but issues like murder are being passed along to state governments or federal governments that have the resources and power to investigate. Then last but not least, we have our what I would consider local legislatures. These can be county and city councils, boards of aldermen, okay, local boards of education. Um, it varies by city, town, or county. Okay, they do pass laws. That's why I would count them as legislatures. But these laws are called ordinances, and they are sometimes seen as more regulation than law. Things like land use, parking, schools, regulation of local business. We see this a lot in Salem when a new business comes into town. There are, and it wants to build and stuff like that. There are certain regulations that it has to meet before it can build. Okay. We saw that with Chick-fil-A a couple years ago when Chick-fil-A came in. Where are we going to put it? It has to meet these specifications. Chick-fil-A wants the building to look like this. Salem wants it to look like this. So we have to compromise. Those sort of things. Those are what we're talking about, these local legislatures passing. They apply only within the confines of their county, city, and town. For example, and we saw this recently. This is a great example with all that's been going on with COVID and coronavirus. Our education policies were different than some school systems around us, okay, and some school systems within the state. Okay, so that's what we talk about when we say these ordinances, these regulations only apply within the boundaries of the county, city, or town. Another good example are those business regulations, those building regulations. If you go to Roanoke, you might see a totally different set of regulations than you do in Salem, okay, when it comes to building a new business. Okay, now the local councils get their power from the state. So it is important that our regulations and our ordinances kind of match up with what the state wants us to do. Okay. So you're not going to see again, using, let's say, the local school board, you're not going to see the local school board varying all that much from what the state board of education says. Okay, like if our local school board thinks that math sucks and they decide, we ought to get rid of math classes altogether, no, that's not going to happen. Okay, that's not the type of power that we have. Okay, so we get our power from the state, and it's kind of important that our ordinances, our regulations line up with state things. And of course, it's important that the state things line up with the national things. All right. And we're going to talk about that more as we move through the lawmaking process. All right, so that's it for lesson one. Okay, where we're headed next, we're still going to be talking about some legislatures next, but we're actually going to get into the actual workings of the legislature. Now, you know what a legislature is. It's the lawmaking body, and they exist at all kinds of levels, local, state, and national. Now we're going to look at how it works. Okay, and I'm going to give you some broad pictures of how the legislature works.